Welcome to this Lunch and Learn on carbon reporting. My name's James Cadman and I work for Action Sustainability, the people behind the Supply Chain Sustainability School. Just a reminder that this is a recorded session, but if you do have any questions as the course progresses, do write them in the chat box in the bottom right-hand corner and we'll endeavour to get back to you with a response within 2 working days. So what are we going to cover in this Lunch and Learn workshop? It's important to know why we're reporting on carbon and what is our global and UK response to carbon and the climate change crisis. But importantly, how should we report our carbon and where do we get our data from? So the first section, why are we reporting on carbon? Let's take a bit of a helicopter view on this. If we look back almost a million years, we'll see that the global concentration of carbon dioxide, the most prevalent greenhouse gas, has been somewhere between 170 and 300 parts per million. And just to describe what that jargon means, parts per million means that for any given million molecules in the air, 300 of them or 250 of them are carbon dioxide. So a relatively low concentration, but important. And you'll see from the graph in front of you that the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has fluctuated fairly steadily up and down over several 100,000 years. And where it's at its peak and its highest, we've had warmer periods, and where the concentration is lower, we've had cooler periods, ice ages, effectively. But you'll notice that in recent years, identified by the dates on the slide, that the concentration of CO2 has been driven up dramatically. And this has been caused largely by the Industrial Revolution and our use of fossil fuels. You can see those key dates on there. Just to put a bit of perspective on this, when we as a species arrived on this planet was about 300,000 years ago. So this is some fairly long-term data that we've gathered from ice cores in Antarctica and other places where we can actually measure the CO2 in the atmosphere in those previous times. What has this meant for the Earth's climate, the Earth's weather? Well, over the last 150 years or so, we've seen a steady rise in global average temperatures. They've basically gone up about 1.1 degrees since pre-industrial times, around 1850, 1840. They've gone up by over a degree on average over the whole globe. Clearly, the temperature is there to keep us in a stable and hospitable living habitat, and 1 degree might not sound like all that much, but it makes a huge difference. 1 degree average over the whole globe makes a big difference. It is more extreme the further north and south you go away from the equator. They have had rises somewhere between 4 and 5 degrees in some places, maybe more, but overall the average has been 1 degree. What has that meant for the weather and the climate that we've seen? We'll all be aware of the forest fires in Australia, forest fires north of the Arctic Circle, extreme weather events in the Caribbean, hurricanes, cyclones, and so on. Dorian, Cyclone Idai off the coast of Mozambique, and many others have been in the news. Flooding in the UK, hot weather events, seasonably abnormal temperatures have all given rise to these kinds of extreme weather events. And essentially, climate change is a multiplier. These weather events happen anyway, they're quite natural, but what climate change is doing is making them happen more frequently and more extremely. So the impacts are worse, the damage is worse and more long lasting. So what causes climate change? The predominant gas, as I've already mentioned, is carbon dioxide, and that comes from anything that we burn, primarily fossil fuels, whether it's coal or oil or gas in the production of energy and power our businesses and our homes, or it's diesel and petrol used in our vehicles. This directly leads to carbon dioxide emissions and the resulting impact on the climate. But there are other gases as well. The next most important is probably methane, CH4, and this is largely linked to the agricultural sector from ruminant animals such as cows and sheep, but also from biodegradation processes, composting and so on, where methane is given off as a byproduct of that rotting process. The next most important is probably nitrous oxide, N2O. And this is a gas that's used in many situations, but the example given here is of it being used as a propellant gas, squirty cream essentially, but it's used in many other situations as well. Some of you might know it as Entonox, pain relief, or more commonly as laughing gas, but it is a very important gas to keep under control in terms of climate change. The next one that is important is sulfur hexafluoride, SF6. This gas is very important in the use of high voltage switchgear, for example, because it's an insulating gas. It is very good at preventing fires. It's not flammable. It's an insulating gas. It's very good for the safety that is paramount in those situations. But it has an extremely high impact on global warming. So it's a double-edged sword. It has benefits, but also disbenefits. Then there's another two groups of compounds, hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. These are used as refrigerant gases. They're the replacements for CFCs that have been banned since the Montreal Protocol. They're used in heating and ventilation, air conditioning equipment, and other bits of equipment as well to drive their processes. Again, like SF6, they're great at what they do. They're really effective. They're not flammable. They don't mix with water. They're not toxic to humans. Wonderful compounds, but they have a big impact on climate. Similarly, in the way that CFCs did. We weren't aware back then that they caused a problem with the ozone layer. We since subsequently found out and did something about it. Why are these 6 gases and groups of gases highlighted? They're the most prevalent, the most relevant to the impact that we have on the climate, and they've come to be known as the Kyoto Protocol basket of 6 greenhouse gases. And it's these that we are focusing most of our effort on in order to reduce the worst impacts of climate change in our societies, our communities, and our economies. We're ultimately trying to limit the rise in global temperatures to 2 degrees, or more recently, well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So that graph I showed you earlier, back to 1850, we're trying to limit that rise. And the way we're going to do that is control the emissions of these gases and all the other things that we do in our businesses. There are many other gases that have impacts, but they're less prevalent. They are less commonly used. So this is the main focus in terms of gaseous emissions. And why are they different? I've already indicated that methane and nitrous oxide and others are far, far worse than carbon dioxide. These are the numbers that give you that indication of what that's like. Carbon dioxide has been designated the value of 1. There are no units, it's not kilos or tons or meters cubed or anything, it's just 1. That's its relative value in terms of how much impact it has on driving global warming in the atmosphere. Relative to that, all the other gases in the basket of 6 have got a number that shows how much worse they are or better than carbon dioxide. So you can see in front of you that methane is 25 times worse than carbon dioxide. So that means that if you emit a ton of methane gas, it's equivalent to emitting 25 tons of carbon dioxide gas. And as you go down the list, you can see the numbers get bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you're working in high voltage switchgear environment and you have a release of 1 kilo of sulfur hexafluoride, that's like emitting almost 23 tons of carbon dioxide. So it's really important to know the difference between these gases and their relative impacts, and therefore what we should be doing about them. But importantly, and part of this lunch and learn, is when you come to report on your emissions, how those play off against each other. Why we have these numbers and the relativity of all of them is so that we can express the total carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas impact in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you'll see at the bottom of the slide, there's the unit TCO2e. That E is very important because we're not just talking about carbon dioxide, we're talking about all the greenhouse gases, the 6 here, and any other niche ones that you might be using as well, so that we can express them in 1 unit of measurement. This is important so we can compare against our other projects, our other sites, our competitors, how we did last year, however you want to benchmark it, to see any progress, any change and improvement. But also so that we've got 1 fixed number that's easy to understand, rather than my emissions of carbon dioxide, my emissions of methane, my emissions of nitrous oxide, and so on. It's easy to understand. The analogy is talking about pounds and dollars and euros. We don't mix all those up, we'll convert to 1 currency. So what you're seeing in front of you is effectively the Bureau de Change exchange rates for greenhouse gases and how you can convert them to make them comparable. And as I say, when it comes to reporting, this is really crucial so that you can express your emissions to a reporting mechanism in 1 clear currency. So the global and the UK response to this. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Paris Climate Change Agreement that occurred at the COP meeting in 2015 and followed in 2016 by the agreement that all nations would sign up to this and make significant progress on Kyoto. And that's all nations in the world that are engaged with this. And the aim there is to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, or better still, keep it to down to 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of the global average rise in temperatures above those pre-industrial levels. So it's a landmark piece of agreement and collaboration globally, and each country has to submit its national contributions, their estimate of how much each country is going to do to reduce its carbon emissions to keep in line with 2 degrees, or even better still, 1.5 degrees. So in the UK, we have a big challenge, but we have a law to help us with that, the Climate Change Act. And as you can see from the graph on the left, the total emissions of carbon dioxide in the UK in 1990 were about 800 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Over time, we've reduced that down to 500 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 2017, and more recently we're somewhere down at around 430, 440 in 2020. A lot of this is due to the fact that we have decarbonised our energy grid. We've moved away from coal and oil, and we have more natural gas in our grid electricity mix, and importantly, a lot more renewable power is in the mix as well, not forgetting we have some nuclear power as well. So we've done a lot to decarbonise our grid, but we have more to do in decarbonising the rest of what we do, the products we manufacture, the products we import, how we heat our buildings and our homes, how we drive and transport goods around, and so on. So all these things add up. And you can see from the next graph how that has shaped up. We've moved down from the 800 million tonnes to about 500 and a bit further on in that solid black line. And what you'll see underneath is that kind of beige grey stepped profile. That's the scenarios that the Committee on Climate Change have developed on how we are going to reduce our carbon. What actions do we need to take as a nation and by different sectors, and how can we drive that forward? And there's lots of different ways we can do that. We have been hearing news about hydrogen being used in homes instead of natural gas to give space heating, and also using air source heat pumps to use green electricity to drive those that then create space heating as well. So there's a whole variety of systems that we have in place to drive ourselves down to a zero carbon situation. And what we're looking to achieve is that by 2050 we'll be net zero as a country in our carbon emissions. Net zero meaning that there's a balance for anything that we do happen to still emit, that there's an offset or a balance or a greenhouse gas removal from the system. That means that overall, on balance, we are zero. And like I say, I'm sure you know of the Climate Change Act to target that net zero objective by 2050. Slight variation across the 4 nations of the UK, as you can see on the screen, depending on the economies in those nations. But essentially, we're aiming for net zero by 2050, if not sooner. And reporting is part of this. How do we know that we're going to get to net zero? How do we know that we're on course to reach net zero? It's through the reporting that we do. And there's various mechanisms for reporting, which we'll come on to. Closer to home, there's the Construction 2025 targets, the key one of which that's relevant to this Lunch and Learn is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2025 against the 1990 baseline. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing is bringing us on target for that, but there's still stuff to do, particularly around embodied carbon within the materials and products that we source and that we use. The direct electricity consumption is relatively easier to tackle. And in the transport sector, we see developments in different fuels and different forms of power, battery power, solar power, HVO, and so on. But the products that we manufacture and buy is a crucial big part of that. So how should we report our carbon? What we're going to cover now is some of the key reporting mechanisms for carbon and greenhouse gases. We've grouped this into 2 key areas, one around legislative requirements, regulation, and the second around voluntary. And you see we've picked on 5 key routes to reporting our carbon depending on the mechanism that we have. We're going to cover off streamlined energy and carbon reporting, SCCR, the Energy Savings and Opportunity Scheme, ESOS, which incidentally is due to carry on post 1st of January 2021. It's in the UK regulation despite EU exit, that will carry on. And then voluntary mechanisms, the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, science-based targets, and the school's Climate Action Group. But just quickly, we're going to recap on what scopes mean. This is fairly fundamental jargon to what we're talking about, understanding what different scopes mean. So essentially, you go through a process of understanding what your control and ownership of your organisation is, and therefore what you're going to be including in your boundaries and where you have that control. And then you look at the scopes, the emission scopes. So anything that you directly control or own, and there's a climate change impact from that, a greenhouse gas emission, that is your scope 1 direct emission. So if you burn a fossil fuel somewhere and you can control that, it's your scope 1, whether it's a boiler in the basement of your facility or it's fuel in the vehicles and plant and equipment that you run and own. That's your scope 1. It also includes any chemical or biological processes that you control. So if you have anaerobic digestion plant and it's giving off methane, that's your scope 1. If you have fugitive emissions of HFCs or PFCs from your air conditioning system, that's your scope 1 as well. And likewise, if you've got a chemical process that emits carbon dioxide or another greenhouse gas as a byproduct, then that will be your scope 1 as well. Scope 2 is your indirect emissions, and there's there's two types of indirect emissions, scope 2 and scope 3. Scope 2 is a particular one, and that's essentially your grid electricity. If you're buying electricity off someone else, they have done the burning on your behalf, they've emitted those carbon emissions on your behalf, and you've bought that power from them. So they've provided that service for you. Scope 3 is all the other services and products you buy, whether it's materials, whether it's business travel services from train companies, taxi companies, and so on, or it's logistics and distribution services that you procure, or the capital goods and machinery that you buy. That's all in your scope 3. So bear that in mind. Scopes 1, 2, and 3 are crucial pieces of information. And so onto the reporting mechanisms. First of all, the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, SCCR. So SCCR has been in force as of the 1st of April 2019. It replaced the much maligned carbon reduction commitment. I don't think anyone was sad to see that go, but it's, as the name implies, it's trying to make it more efficient and a clearer reporting mechanism than the previous CRC. The qualification for it, and this is where it incorporates the mandatory greenhouse gas reporting that already existed, that was incorporated into directors' reports, but it takes it further. It covers all quoted companies, whether you're on the London Stock Exchange, the European Economic Area Stock Exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, whichever. If you are a quoted company, you need to report, but it's extending it to also include large unquoted companies and limited liability partnerships. And the criteria, the thresholds for having to report are greater than £36 million in turnover, or a balance sheet of greater than £18 million, and or you've got more than 250 employees. And it requires you to report if you cover 2 or 3 of those. Clearly, that's looking at companies that are not SMEs, looking at the employee numbers. So we're looking at larger businesses here. In terms of what you have to report, the scopes and the processes, you have to calculate your scopes 1 and 2 from your activities. If you're a quoted company, that's globally, not just UK. But if you're a large unquoted company or an LLP, it's just the UK. And it's those for which you are responsible. So this is the scope 1 and 2, where you have the control over how you use and consume those services, those materials, those fuels to deliver your product, your business. Scope 3 is also included for large unquoted and LLP businesses, for your business travel, where you are responsible for purchasing the fuel. So that's an important slight difference there. And then you also have to include the underlying energy use for your gas, your fuel, your electricity, and your transport. So we're talking here in terms of megajoules or gigajoules of the energy that goes into providing that power and ultimately those carbon emissions. If it's electricity, it's going to be in kilowatt hours, megawatt hours. There are some additional requirements. It's not just about the numbers. So you need to provide also an intensity ratio to show how productive and efficient you are. So for example, the most commonly used one is emissions per pound of turnover or per £1 million of turnover, or it could be per gross internal floor area, some metric that normalizes it so you can see how efficient the business is with its energy consumption. And then over time, how more productive and more efficient it's getting. Similarly, for that comparative piece, you need to look at providing your previous year's energy and greenhouse gas emissions and intensity figures to show that change in that comparison. You need to state which calculation method you're using. Commonly, it's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. There's also an equivalent ISO standard, 14064, to show what you're doing. You don't have to follow those. You can show your own workings in effect, but commonly people follow one or other of those emission standards, calculation methodologies. And then you need to put some narrative on this. You need to provide some information on the energy efficiency actions that you've taken to proactively reduce your carbon emissions. And there are some examples on screen. Smart metering to get better data, actually installing more efficient equipment, bringing in renewable power to directly reduce your carbon load, and then the behavioural piece, the training and the upskilling of your staff and your colleagues and your clients, your suppliers as well. That's all important. Reporting is done annually, and it's done for the financial year starting on or after the 1st of April, and it depends when your financial year is, so you need to slot in on that, but it's an annual reporting. Most organisations, from our experience, find themselves reporting somewhere in the summer months once they've gathered all their data. And when you have that, you file it in your director's report at Companies House. So this is a bit different to how the CRC used to work, where you filed it directly with the Environment Agency in that case. As with all these schemes, there's always some exceptions, some clauses, some voluntary aspects to it. If you consume less than 40 megawatt hours of energy per year, then you can be exempt. 40 megawatt hours is fairly low. So, you've got to be a really low energy using business to get out on that count. If you're a subsidiary and you're below the qualification threshold in terms of your turnover and your employees, you may be exempt. This is where it differs to the CRC. There's no kind of mother company, head company that will direct that says you have to be included if they're included. If you as a subsidiary, an autonomous subsidiary, are below those thresholds, you can be exempt from that. So this is where it differs from CRC. Do take note of that. And as I said above, scope 3 is voluntary in many cases. And there's a URL provided. These slides will be provided and made available for you to download, so you can grab this information and review it in your own good time. And there's the relevant web link as well to the government website. So that was SCCR. Some people call it SECA, SCCR, whichever. We're now going to move on to the Energy Savings and Opportunity Scheme, ESOS. Now that is called ESOS. And as I said a minute ago, this one is continuing through 2021 as much as we understand at this stage, because it is in UK regulation already and it will be continued. So this has been around for quite some time, since July 2014, as part of a European directive, driving through energy opportunities and ideally acting on those across businesses. The qualifications here are slightly different from SCCR, so this is where you need to pay attention. They are similar but different, and you can get tripped up by those differences if you're not careful. So you qualify if you're a large undertaking with more than 250 employees, so that's the same, but the turnover threshold is different. It's not £36 million, it's nearer £45 million. It's been set originally at €50 million. Currently 46 million pounds, and a balance sheet of about 39 million pounds. So that's double what we saw in SCCR. Or you can be included if you're part of a larger organisation which meets the above criteria, the UK's highest parent, the mothership approach that we saw in the CRC. This follows the same mechanism there, that you are included even if you yourselves and your subsidiary don't comply with those qualifications, but if your parent company does, you get hoovered up amongst that. SCCR is different, so as I say, do be aware of that. Likewise, if you're an overseas company with a UK registered establishment that has 250 more employees, you'll get pulled into it as well. So take note of those different criteria. The scopes and processes, again, similar to SCCR, but they do vary. Essentially, we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions. Essentially, we're looking at how we can measure them and then reduce them. So they all have a similar goal in mind, but how they go about it is slightly different. So here you need to calculate your energy use from the assets, the buildings, the vehicles, and the activities for which you're responsible, your scopes 1 and 2. You need to identify any significant areas of consumption. What are the hotspots that consume the most amount of energy and release the most amount of greenhouse gases? And within that, you need to account for at least 90% of all your consumption. You don't need to go after every last little item of energy. You need to be, taking the 80-20 rule, but you have to provide evidence to make it clear why you're excluding some things and not others. Importantly, in this case, you need to appoint a lead assessor to carry out energy audits on site and undertake the ESOS assessment. So they need to come on site with a clipboard and go around and understand where those opportunities might be. Where could you reduce your consumption? Could you move to a variable speed drive from a fixed speed? Could you change your lighting from older style to more efficient LEDs? Could you change your fleet away from diesel to electric vehicles or hybrids? Are the materials that you're buying consuming a lot of energy in their manufacture and their processing and their cold storage, for example? Could you move to a different process? There's a myriad of things that you could possibly do. And the lead assessor will carry out that energy audit and provide a report on those opportunities. You need to provide that person with 12 months of continuous data so they can see what the backstory is, and they do their analysis and they identify their opportunities. Importantly, and this is their role, those opportunities need to be practicable and cost effective to implement and give you cost benefit. They can't be pie in the sky, shall we say. They have to be reasonable for you to actually implement and make a financial saving with a reasonable return on investment. The catch in all of this is there's no actual regulatory requirement to implement the opportunities identified. There's nothing in the regulation that says that thou shalt have to do this, but it would be churlish not to take the advice of that lead assessor and auditor to put those measures in place. In terms of what you do with your report, you have to submit it online as a notification of compliance to the Environment Agency, and you have to keep your records. And if you don't do that, there are civil sanctions and fines for non-compliance. Again, a bit like CRC in that respect. So you have to make sure it's in on time and that it meets all the requirements in terms of the energy that's provided and it's sent to the right person. So in that respect, it does hark back to how the CRC functioned. Reporting here is not annually, it's every 4 years. There are ESOS reporting phases. We're currently in the third compliance period. I'm recording this at the end of 2020, but the compliance period lasts for another 3 years that we're currently in. And organisations report to the regulator for where their head offices are registered, depending on the 4 nations of the UK. And you can see those on the screen. It's the various environment agencies across the 4 nations of the UK. Fines can be applied for failing to notify the regulator if you've done something slightly differently, simply for maintaining records or not undertaking an audit, or for making a misleading statement, whether deliberately or accidentally. It's important to make sure that your data is accurate. As with SCCR, there are some exceptions and exemptions. If you've got the ISO 50001 Energy Management Certificate, you comply with ESOS. They have been aligned deliberately to say that if you have the former, you comply with the latter. You only simply need to inform the Environment Agency regulator that you have ISO 50001, you comply, and here's the evidence. Similarly, if you have display energy certificates, those are recognised as partial evidence towards compliance. And then finally, there's the URL, the link to further information. So that was the main legislative areas of compliance. There are others out there. There's the climate change levy and issues around that, but that's more of a tax rather than a reporting mechanism. There's of course the emissions trading scheme, which is undergoing some changes potentially, but that's for really large energy consuming businesses, and that's a cap and trade process that does require reporting as well, but it's more about buying and selling and capping and trading those carbon credits and emissions. So we're going to move on to voluntary reporting mechanisms, the first of which is the CDP. Used to be known as Carbon Disclosure Project, they now call themselves CDP. So what's their purpose? They're out to gather climate change related data from large corporations on behalf of their institutional investors globally and larger procuring organisations to help them understand their position with respect to greenhouse gas emissions of their supply chain. They want to be able to not only know what the numbers are, but to identify and manage their risks and look at ways of reducing them. So it's requiring that data to help then use the information to reduce risks and take opportunities. Scope and process, again, is similar. Like I say, all these systems are about understanding the emissions now and what we can do about them to reduce them. They're looking across all sources and they're quoting scopes 1, 2 and 3, and that's to be indicated in the submission by the applicant. And then reporting is a bit more extensive than SCCR and ESOS. We're not just talking about emissions and the activities to reduce emissions. There's a very extensive questionnaire to gather data. And you can see some of those things on the screen in terms of what's required. It's not just the data itself, but it's your governance procedures, how your organisation is structured to manage its carbon impact. Where are the risks and opportunities that have been identified and what's being done about them? What are the targets to get there and how are they actually calculating their emissions? So on and so on. It's very, very comprehensive. Again, you need to choose your method of calculation and state what that is. Disclosure is on an annual basis, and it's a fairly involved process to gather all that data and then to submit it to CDP for verification. The thing that's clear here is that CDP is at the core of a lot of this, and they are making clear links to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and other mechanisms that you can see on the screen, particularly science-based targets. And then finally, there's the main link to the CDP website. CDP also covers water consumption and other aspects, but they're known best for climate change and carbon. So, Science-Based Targets Initiative, the next one. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this and are wondering what it's all about. So the SBT is a partnership between the CDP we've just heard about, the UN Global Compact from the United Nations, and the World Resources Institute, well-established organisation in understanding sustainability issues and our impacts on global environment, and the World Wildlife Fund, the WWF. So the SBT is a way of allowing any organisation to set their carbon emissions reduction targets in line with the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So you remember I was talking about what's our trajectory so that we can bring our emissions down so that we stay well below a 2 degrees warming scenario, or ideally a 1.5 degree warming scenario. Some very clever people have modelled that trajectory, that diagonal line coming down, and within that it tells us how many tons of carbon dioxide emission and other greenhouse gases we can emit to stay on that trajectory. And it's a diminishing number, which is what's driving us to be more resourceful, to use more renewable power, to use more recycled content, and do all the things we can to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels and other greenhouse gas emissions. The SBTI is a way of modeling that for an individual organization and a sector to say, well, how can that organization contribute to that downward trajectory? What does it mean in terms of the emissions that you are allowed to make, reducing emissions over the next 30 odd years? And within that, you can identify opportunities to reduce carbon and reduce cost, and ultimately report that to your clients as well. So the scope and process. You need to select a suitable trajectory pathway. That diagonal line coming down I mentioned a minute ago. Is it absolute for your organization, or is it a sectoral base, depending on what sector you're working in? And then putting targets on that within the SBT method. It definitely covers your own scope 1 and 2 emissions. Clearly you have control over those, but it also includes your scope 3 emissions if those account for more than 40% of your total emissions. So if you've got all of your emissions for all scopes 1, 2 and 3, if your supply chain upstream and downstream accounts for 40% or more of that pie chart, you need to include scope 3 as well. And that's the tricky bit, because that's stuff that's outside of your 4 walls. You need to engage with your suppliers, your providers, your service providers as well to help you with that information and work with you on that. You then develop a plan that has a 5 to 15 year time frame to deliver. What actions are you going to take to reduce your emissions as well as those of the supply chain? And then you review and iterate it every so often. Reporting here is annual, a bit like CDP, and you can provide your carbon emissions data and the actions that you've undertaken to show how you're staying on your trajectory. Are you sticking to target, essentially? What are you doing about it? And clearly you'll have a strategic plan, a carbon reduction plan to help you with that. And you'll, like most organizations, you'll deal with the low-hanging fruit first. What can you put in place? Some of the examples I gave earlier, like moving fleet to electric vehicles or hybrids, for example. If you're talking about scope 3 embodied carbon emissions of your supply chain, looking at those materials that have got lower embodied carbon, low carbon concrete, low carbon steel, low carbon plasterboard, whatever the product might be, and engaging your suppliers, particularly through your procurement process and other routes, to collaborate on how those reductions can be made, and then ultimately report them. Okay, so that was Science-Based Targets Initiative. Last but not least is the Supply Chain Schools Climate Action Group, which is, again, voluntary and free. So what's the purpose of this group? We're here to drive a reduction in carbon emissions for the built environment, like all the other things we've been talking about. We're going to measure and manage the magnitude of those carbon emissions using our online performance tool. We have a piece of software that can capture activity data, primary data, such as litres of diesel used or kilowatt hours of electricity used. The tool then does all the clever calculations and turns that into tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then from that, we can identify where the hotspots are, where the priorities are, and how we can take action on those. This is very important because it helps individual organizations know where they should focus their activity. It helps the partner clients in the school understand what their scope 3 emissions look like, and it drives action. It gives the evidence base to drive the action to actively reduce our emissions. And it's in a collaborative, consistent sense. We are a big group of organizations across the school, and driving that consistency and coherence is key to that. So again, scopes and processes, you know the routine by now. So you're asked to identify your sources of carbon emissions from within your UK operations, covering primarily your scope 1 and 2 emissions. So the fuel that you put into your vehicles, the gas that powers your boiler, your electricity from the grid is very important and is probably key to this. You should also be including your scope 3 emissions if you are the manufacturing point of carbon intensive materials and products, because you're the ones consuming the energy to drive that. So you're knowing what your scope 1 and 2 emissions are to create those products and those materials, but also the embedded carbon of the primary materials that you are insourcing to create your product. If you're a business that installs or fits some of those products, the embodied energy is already there, and that comes from your supplier in effect. So for you, if you're an installer or a fitter, those kinds of organizations, it's primarily your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then we want to capture that activity data I talked about. We're not asking organizations to go and calculate their carbon footprint. The school does that for you. We're asking you to provide your miles traveled, your tons of plasterboard procured, your liters of diesel, and so on. And backing all that up is the resource bank in the supply chain school, all the good learning that is available through the school. We're asking organizations to report quarterly. You can report more quickly than that, more frequently, on a monthly basis should you wish, but quarterly seems to be the best approach for that. And there's the link if you want to get involved. It's on the school's webpage. If you click on the partners tab at the top, you'll get a drop down that will lead you to the climate action group. So that's the overview of the reporting mechanisms and what's required in terms of their reporting, whether you qualify or not, what you have to report, when you have to report it, how frequently, and who you have to report it to in order to comply and not potentially get a fine. But behind all that sits a whole load of data. It sounds relatively straightforward, but you need a whole bunch of data from different sources to be able to put in that submission to the SCCR or ESOS, or if you're doing it voluntarily, to science-based targets, for example. So where does that information come from? This picture talks to the different areas where your data might come from. So if we focus on the middle one, your business, this is the scope 1 emissions yourself. So your own vehicles, your own buildings, any plant and equipment that you own yourselves, your HVAC systems and so on. That's your direct business footprint. That's scope 1 and 2. If you look to the left with your suppliers, this could be called your embodied carbon. So if it's in a material that you buy in, like timber, steel, concrete, there's an embodied carbon in that. Some people call it a capital carbon in terms of the embodied carbon, or cap carb as to shorten it even further. That's often used in the infrastructure sector, but that's applying to the materials and the products that you're buying and installing and fabricating. And that's generally your upstream scope 3. Your other indirect, your suppliers, you can also look at your utilities suppliers as providing you a service as opposed to a product. So your waste contractors, your water company that provides you your local water supply, they're also part of your scope 3. As you heard me say earlier, electricity is seen as different, grid electricity, so that's scope 2, but it's still indirect emissions that are done on your behalf by one of your suppliers. So npower, SSE will be one of your suppliers in effect. And then looking to the right-hand side, you've got your client, where you sell your product or your asset or your facility, your building, to your client. And that is downstream scope 3 indirect carbon, and that's sometimes called end user carbon or used carb, and it's all the emissions from running those facilities and buildings that you have taken part in constructing for a client. So there's a thing there about understanding where your boundaries are. What are you liable for? What are you in control of? What do you own? And what are you going to report? And then comparing that to what the reporting regulations ask you to report. So having a picture of this for your organization is really helpful. What do we own and control? What is in our supply chain? There's electricity, there's waste where necessary, and then there's also all our clients as well. So where do we get our data from? What you can see on the screen, these 6 different hexagons kind of talk about the main areas of information that you need. Your electricity and gas will come from billings. It's probably on your SAP system or your Oracle system somewhere, what your billings are, meter readings, that's really important. Similarly with vehicle fuel, that might come from fuel cards. It might come from expenses claims from your staff. It might be metered if you have a depot at your facility where you get your fuel delivered. Business travel as well, I mentioned the travel agency that might hold that data for you, or your HR team. Materials, often from your procurement team or your bill of quants, your QSs will have a handle on how much material you've consumed, that you've bought and that you're using, and then from that you can work out what the embodied carbon is. Similarly with capital goods, actually, it's the same kind of approach there. And then waste and water, those are service utilities similar to electricity. You'll have billing somewhere by meters cubed or kilowatt hours or tonnages that have been processed. Accessing that data from your system or from the contract manager that holds that data is key. So in terms of where that data comes from, I've already mentioned that some of it will come from purchase ledgers or from meter readings or billings. That's great if you can get hold of that. Sometimes it's not as easy as that though. Sometimes you get presented data that's in the amount of money that's spent, for example. And that's a common example of proxy data, where you'll have to work out what the consumption has actually been to then enable you to say what the carbon impact has been. So it might be you've spent £1,000 on fuel. Knowing what the price of that fuel is per litre, you can then work out how many litres you've bought, and then from that, using conversion factors, you can understand what that litres means in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. In some circumstances, you might not be able to get all the data you can, so you might have to do a sampling process and gather information from different sources and then scale it up. So a good example of that would be understanding how much energy you use in a shared office environment. You don't have your own exact data for your office, but you know that the overall office facility consumes X amount of energy, and on a square floor area, you consume Y% of that, assuming that everyone has roughly similar energy consumptions across those different offices. So you can do a sampling process. There are different ways and means of doing it. Once you've got your data, or once you're accessing your data, do think how it's relevant to your situation. Be careful about reliability and how biased or otherwise the data might be. Is it up to date? Do check that it is valid and reliable, credible information. Similarly, think about how much time you've got to give to this. Think about the 80-20 rule. We saw earlier in the ESOS regulation that we're looking to cover at least 90% of energy use. We're not looking to cover all 100%. It's a similar mindset here. Think about what you can gather reasonably and the benefit it will give you to go after all the data that you can possibly get your hands on. So in terms of some relevant standards, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is probably the most prevalent one for understanding how to report organisational emissions. As I said, there's an ISO 14064 standard, which is equivalent. A lot of organisations use the GHG protocol. It's very clear on how you allocate your emissions and how you quantify them and how you report them. So that is a really key document. I'm not expecting you to read this slide by any means, but when you come to refer to this later, there's a lot of free information out there to help you to do all these calculations. The first couple of bullet points are conversion factors. So those are the numbers that help convert you from 1 litre of diesel. What does 1 litre of diesel mean in carbon dioxide? How many tons of carbon does that equate to? The DEFRA conversion factors are free. They're available on their websites. They get updated every year. They will give you that accepted data, emissions factors, conversions factors, they're called, to convert a kilowatt hour of electricity, a litre of diesel, so on and so on, into the equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. Similarly, the Bath inventory of carbon and energy is more around materials, converting, what a ton of concrete equates to in terms of kilos of carbon dioxide or tons of carbon dioxide. And then there's many, many calculators out there that have kind of been pre-populated with this data that you can just plug in what you've been using and how much you've consumed, and it'll give you the carbon dioxide number. There's a few examples there. There are many others out there. Some are free, some you'll have to pay for. I very much recommend you go for a free one first before you put your hand in your pocket, because much of the underlying data is free, but there's many of them out there. So have a look at those later if you need to get some basic raw data. And then finally, just to take a wider view, just to lift our heads up from that reporting mechanism process. Part of the reason we're doing this is more than just compliance. We're looking at reducing our risk of energy security, that we're going to be resilient in terms of energy consumption. We're going to be ahead of regulation, making sure that we're on the ball in terms of what we have to report to stay compliant. We can look to identify hotspots and make carbon reductions and immediate cost savings. So it makes business sense to do this as well as regulatory sense. Can we identify those savings? Can we put actions in place that will actually save us cash? And that will, again, make us more resilient as a business. More widely, this helps us improve our reputation and our standing in the wider world, that we are being proactive against the impacts of climate change and what we can do about it. Reporting is just one way of demonstrating that to the outside world. But in doing so, it not only meets the regulatory compliance requirements, but it shows that we are meeting our clients' demands and help us win more work, new work, that we are taking active action against the issues of climate change, and that will be reflected in how we do business. But beneath all of that is data accuracy. So making sure that we have accurate data is paramount. So that is the end of this Lunch and Learn. I hope you found it beneficial. As I said a few minutes ago, the slides are available for download, as is this recording. So do come back and review it as you wish. And should you have any questions, do submit them through the chat function and we'll endeavour to get back to you as soon as possible. So thank you for now. Goodbye.